let's talk a bit about China-Africa trade. Where are we right now? We know that in 2011 we reached levels of about $166 billion.
Absolutely, Mashudu, thank you. And it's always a big question as to, so is this a big number?
Mm-hmm.
And if you look at the fact that in 2000 China-Africa trade was sitting at $10 billion, it really is. But then if you look at the fact that China-Africa trade is pretty much the same as China's trade with South Korea, for instance, what is most striking about China-Africa trade numbers is more the increase year on year than the absolute numbers in and of themselves.
Well, we're almost done with 2011. What kind of numbers could we see coming through on this front?
Well, I think we have a lot to take into consideration, particularly given concerns around what people are calling a hard landing in China. Those fears do seem to have subsided by and large, and it seems that there is going to be a bit of a kickoff in investment in China, and as a result outgoing Chinese investment and an uptick in trade and exports once the leadership transition is complete. So I think at the end of 2012 we're probably looking at something like in the region of 170, 180 billion US dollars in terms of bilateral trade.
All this investment coming through from China. Where's all this money going to, and which countries in particular?
Well, the Chinese investors, like many other investors in Africa, have shown a marked tendency to go into oil and gas, mining, and increasingly large-scale infrastructure projects, mostly because these are actually support infrastructure networks for these mining and oil and gas projects that the Chinese investors are involved in. Interestingly enough, though, South Africa tops the list in terms of a recipient of Chinese FDI. That is particularly in terms of its the ICBC deal.
Okay.
Then we also have, funnily enough though, Sudan, Nigeria, the DRC and Zambia. So we can see where essentially the Chinese investment preferences are lying.
Maybe let's talk on the new incoming president as well as the premier. I don't even want to try and pronounce the names. What do they bring for Africa, and what do we know about them?
Well, interestingly enough, given their high profile now, very little is actually known about them personally. What we do know, for instance, about Li Keqiang, who's going to step in as the position of premier, is that he was actually on the Finance and Economic Leading Small Group previously, which was essentially the body that sorted out China's finance and economic issues and essentially made sure that China got through the global crisis without too much of a hiccup. As the premier, his primary responsibility will be looking after China's economy, and his going forward, what he's going to have to do is rebalance the economy in terms of turning more inward in terms of domestic consumption rather than an export-led growth pattern. How this translates for African countries is predominantly going to be in terms of the demand that these kinds of economic policies are going to have for what we export to China, obviously in terms of steel, in terms of other base minerals like copper and gold, and obviously oil.
There's also been quite a lot of criticism to say that China is only going after resources and minerals of the African continent. Is that really justified in your view?
Well, I think if you look at the profile of other investors in Africa, you'd see that they weren't particularly different, regardless of where they actually come from. And interestingly enough, increasingly Chinese investors have started looking into telecommunications, transport networks, and these are key elements in terms of an African growth strategy. So I suppose the criticism is valid, but in a global context, maybe not so much.